There is a set of numbers that most California households have not looked at closely enough. The water bill arrives every month, or in many cases every 2 months, and it gets paid alongside the rent or the mortgage, the utilities, the car insurance. For most of the past decade, that bill went up modestly, sometimes significantly during drought years, and then settled back down. That pattern is changing in ways that are structural and permanent, rather than temporary and drought-related. In 2024, the California State Water Resources Control Board adopted regulations that created the first mandatory permanent water conservation framework in the state's history, not emergency measures tied to a specific drought, but ongoing requirements designed to reshape how water is delivered and used across California through the year 2040 and beyond. At the same time, the wholesale cost of imported water is rising in ways that are flowing directly into household bills. The fines written into the new framework are not small. The timeline for enforcement is not distant. And for millions of California residents, the connection between these regulatory and infrastructure changes and what they will see on their monthly bill is not yet understood. The foundation of what changed in 2024 is legislation that was actually passed 6 years earlier. In 2018, the California legislature passed Assembly Bill 1668 and Senate Bill 606, a two-bill package that directed the State Water Resources Control Board to develop permanent mandatory water use standards for urban water suppliers throughout the state. The laws establish that water conservation should be a California way of life, not a crisis response activated when reservoirs drop below a certain threshold and deactivated when they refilled, but a baseline operating condition built into the regulatory structure of how every major water agency in the state does business. It took 6 years of regulatory development, public comment periods, and repeated revisions before the State Water Board finally adopted the implementing regulations in July 2024. Those regulations took effect on January 1, 2025. Enforcement of conservation targets, however, does not begin until 2027, giving water agencies a 2-year preparation period. The scale of the regulation is significant. It applies to 405 urban water suppliers across California, agencies and utilities that collectively serve approximately 95% of the state's population. These include the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, serving roughly 19 million people, and hundreds of mid-sized water districts throughout the Central Valley, Bay Area, Inland Empire, and Central Coast. For almost every Californian who receives water from a public or private utility, the new regulations apply to the agency delivering that water. The mechanism of the new regulations is a system of individualized water budgets, officially called water use objectives. Each of the 405 covered suppliers must calculate a specific water budget for its service area, built from 4 components: residential indoor water use, residential outdoor water use, commercial and institutional landscape use with dedicated irrigation meters, and the supplier's maximum allowable water loss from leakage. The sum of these components defines the total volume of water that supplier is budgeted to deliver each year. Under the new regulations, suppliers must meet their water use objective by 2027, and then reduce it further in 5-year intervals through 2040. By 2040, suppliers will need to be in compliance with consumption levels that do not exceed 70% of their 2026 water use as a baseline measure. The distribution of required reductions is not uniform. Suppliers in the Bay Area, where outdoor irrigation is lower due to the region's cooler climate, face comparatively modest reductions. Some Southern California inland suppliers serving regions with extensive residential outdoor irrigation were originally estimated to need reductions exceeding 30%. The regulations include provisions for suppliers serving lower-income communities that face large required cuts, those required to reduce use by more than 20%, and serving communities with household incomes below the state median may comply by cutting use at 1% per year, provided they meet other requirements. Suppliers facing cuts above 30% have a similar 2% per year compliance pathway. What matters for the average California household is what suppliers will need to do to meet these targets, and how those actions will affect individual water bills. The regulation is directed at suppliers, not at individual residents or businesses. It does not directly prohibit a homeowner in Sacramento from watering their lawn on a particular day. What it requires is that the agencies delivering water ensure the total volume they deliver stays within the budgeted limits. Suppliers have several tools available: tiered rate structures that charge higher prices as consumption increases, restrictions on outdoor irrigation covering specific days or hours, investments in water recycling and efficiency infrastructure, rebate programs for water-efficient appliances and drought-tolerant landscaping, and rate increases across the board. In practice, most suppliers will use a combination of all these approaches. The fine structure for non-compliance is direct. Suppliers that fail to meet their water use objectives after 2027 can face fines of up to $10,000 per day. These are not one-time penalties. They accumulate for as long as the supplier remains out of compliance. For a large utility serving a major metropolitan area, $10,000 per day is manageable against operating budgets running into the hundreds of millions annually. For a mid-sized district serving tens of thousands of customers with a more constrained financial structure, sustained daily fines would create severe pressure to act quickly. The State Water Board has authority to pursue these penalties through administrative processes and can escalate enforcement through other regulatory channels. The State Water Board's own economic analysis estimated the cost of compliance across all covered suppliers through 2050 at approximately $4.7 billion. The same analysis projected that suppliers and their customers would save approximately $6.2 billion over the same period, primarily from purchasing less water, for a net estimated benefit of roughly $1.5 billion statewide. Water savings projected through 2040 reach 1.7 million acre-feet, enough to supply approximately half of California's population for 1 year. Environmental groups and several legislators expressed concern when the final regulations were adopted that the targets had been weakened considerably from earlier proposals. An earlier version had projected savings of 6.3 million acre-feet through 2040, more than 3 times the volume in the final rule. Heather Cooley of the Pacific Institute described the situation by noting that while reservoirs were full in 2024 following several wet years, there was a tendency to forget about water scarcity and drought. Separately from the new mandatory conservation framework, California households are facing water bill increases arriving through the standard rate-setting process. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California approved rate increases of 8.5% for 2025 and an additional 8.5% for 2026 at the wholesale level. These increases flow directly to retail customers through the local agencies purchasing water from MWD and delivering it to homes and businesses. California Water Service received authorization from the California Public Utilities Commission for interim rate adjustments of approximately 3% in most of its service districts effective January 4. The company's larger pending rate case proposed increases ranging from approximately 16 to 22% depending on the service area, roughly $16 to $22 more per month for average residential customers in the Monterey, Southern California, and Sacramento areas. California American Water filed a comparable rate case in July 2025 proposing increases in the 16 to 22% range for its service areas. In San Diego County, Santa Fe Irrigation District implemented increases effective January 4, 2026, driven in part by the expiration of a 25-year grant that had subsidized recycled water costs since 2000. The affordability dimension of these combined pressures is receiving increasing attention. The State Water Board's own analysis found that approximately 21% of California's water systems, serving 18% of all state residents, already had water rates that were unaffordable relative to standard measures based on cost as a share of median household income before the full implementation of the new mandatory conservation framework and before the multi-year rate increases currently moving through the rate case process. At the household level, the analysis identified roughly 34% of households earning below 200% of the federal poverty level as potentially needing rate assistance. The State Water Board has recommended a statewide low-income water rate assistance program modeled on federal energy assistance programs, but as of early 2026, that program has not been funded at scale. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power maintains its own enforcement framework for outdoor water use under permanent municipal ordinances that apply regardless of whether the region is in an active drought emergency. Customers found to be in violation receive a written warning on first contact. Subsequent violations result in fines ranging from $100 to $600, escalating with repeated violations. LADWP's restrictions limit sprinkler irrigation to a maximum of 8 minutes per station per watering day, prohibit all outdoor watering between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., and prohibit runoff onto streets and driveways. Valley Water in Santa Clara County has implemented restrictions specifically targeting decorative non-functional turf at commercial, industrial, and institutional properties, with violations subject to fines under a local ordinance adopted in coordination with state directives. The broader context for all of these developments is California's long-term water supply outlook. The state faces a projected water supply shortfall of approximately 10% by 2040, even under current use patterns, driven by warming temperatures reducing Sierra Nevada snowpack, increased evaporation, and overextended groundwater basins. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014 set a framework for bringing those basins into balance by 2040, a process requiring agricultural districts to reduce pumping and placing constraints on water availability in regions that relied heavily on groundwater during drought years. The Colorado River, which provides a significant portion of Southern California's imported water, has been subject to extended negotiations over a declining resource, with new interim operating guidelines reducing California's effective deliveries and requiring the Metropolitan Water District to rely more heavily on stored reserves and alternative supplies. The enforcement calendar that most directly affects water agencies and their customers runs through 2027. Agencies are required to submit annual reports beginning in January 2025, documenting their water use objectives and actual use. The first year that a supplier could face $10,000 per day fines for failing to meet its objectives is 2027. The 2-year period from 2025 through 2026 is a preparation window in which agencies are building systems, updating rate structures, implementing efficiency programs, and documenting progress, but not yet subject to financial penalties for shortfalls. What this means practically for California residents is that 2026 is a year in which financial and operational changes are taking shape without yet being fully visible in enforcement terms. Rate increases approved through the standard rate case process are arriving in bills beginning January 2026. Infrastructure investments that water agencies are making to comply with the new framework are being financed through those rate increases. The conservation programs, rebate offerings, and irrigation restrictions that will define compliance pathways for individual suppliers are being developed and in many cases already implemented. The requirement that suppliers comply with their budgets by 2027 creates a specific proximate deadline that has immediate implications for the rates they set, the programs they offer, and the restrictions they may impose. Further developments are expected as the first full year of annual reporting under the new regulatory framework concludes in early 2026. As rate case decisions are issued by the California Public Utilities Commission for major utilities, and as the 2027 enforcement date approaches,